And all of a sudden, he gets bombarded with demonic ravens who are calling out cackles and mocking his faith. And he swipes at them with his crozier. They'll disappear into black smoke and then reform to continue to mock him.
Gracious gang, it's Mike Creavey, host of the Gracious Guest Show, here with you again for another episode of the Gracious Guest Show, and I'm delighted today to jump into a really cool series of topics and interrelated things that are all strange and kooky, and one might say, weird. I have the author of the Weird Catholic Handbook from Sophia Institute Press, Mr. Michael Lichens, with me. Before we do that, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, like this content, share it far and wide. I think you're really going to enjoy this. Michael Lichens is an author, editor, and researcher based in Colorado, where he takes a special interest in the overlooked or forgotten aspects of Christian history. He holds an MA from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and his writings have appeared in both Catholic and mainstream publications. When he is not busy revising or editing, Michael is often found exploring local cemeteries or diving into the history of an eclectic building. And you can follow him over at his website, mlichens.com. That's M as in Mike, Lichens.com, where I also noticed on his website he's been on various things like EWTN, Bookmark. He's also appeared with George Norrie, host of Coast to Coast AM, as well on what was the show there? Let me get it here. It was not on Coast to Coast AM, but on a program called Beyond Belief with George Norrie as well. So please enjoy this. It's a lot of fun, and make sure you check out Michael's book, which I've linked below, Weird Catholic Handbook. All things weird Catholic history and Catholic experience, here with author Michael Lichens. Check it out. Well, here, this is exciting. I let me back up here. I have a faith-haunted beer critic with a writing problem, says his website. Michael Lichens, thank you so much for joining me on the Gracious Guest Show.
My pleasure, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Now, to be fair, you didn't include, I think, that little moniker in our sort of email exchanges. I'm on your website, and I was like, that's a good, I like that. Is that on a business card, maybe? Or
no, I just thought it was a good summary of what I do professionally and
nice
in my hobbies. So there you are.
Nice. Well, this is exciting. I have this wonderful privilege lately, just in the last few months, where somehow I ended up on Sophia Institute Press's kind of PR email list, and I actually have to say no now to some of these invitations because it's such a wonderful problem to have, all these wonderful books, that they're putting out. And but one that I definitely didn't say no to is when I'm like, Weird Catholic Handbook, that how do you pass that up? So I of course have my copyright right here, and wanted to have you on today, and I've of course got the links below and everything for folks, but we can't cover of course all of it, and I don't want to give too much away, but why don't you just start off, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and maybe kind of what led to the text here actually coming to fruition.
Yeah, the text is very much a result of a lot of interest and hobbies I've had throughout my life. I was born in Oregon with my mom's side of the family is Irish Catholic and tells a lot of great stories. Sure. I converted later in the faith, but I still grew up with a lot of stories. My Aunt Deanna gave me a book on the Incorruptibles when I was in my teens, things like that. And I've always had this interest in the overlooked or the strange parts of history. On family vacations, I was a kid that wanted to see battle monuments or a haunted house.
Sure. Nice.
And that continued into adulthood. It's still, I have to go find this random monument no one's heard of, or this shrine that no one's...
Is everybody else like, stick to the itinerary? You're like, no, I gotta... No.
Occasionally, no, especially I remember taking family to church and... not to church, sorry, to Rome, but their complaint is like, how many more churches and relics are you going to point out? And I'm like, it's Rome. I have to.
Right.
But,
yeah,
absolutely. So that's where this interest in this book is kind of been a lifelong passion. I wrote it during a particular rough time in my life, as many writers do, wrote through the pain. And it was actually spiritually healing to reflect on some of these odder, more bizarre points from our past that we would overlook, but I find a lot of spiritual
Sure.
comfort in them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, I mean, there is well, and you'll appreciate this actually on my notebook I have here. This is a little shout out to um, Chris Lewis at Baratus Catholic. He's not paying me to say this, but Chris has got some
Sure.
great stuff. But I've got my little memento mori
Oh,
right on the cover. It's
yes.
that iridescent kind of thing, which is cool too. But obviously, that's similar on the front here. And you have that macabre kind of imagery there, and maybe that might be a fun place to maybe just start as far as
Sure.
has that been something for you? I mean, you talk about so many things in here. I didn't mention this ahead of time, but maybe why don't we mention relics a little bit, since you mentioned that.
Hmm.
How is that, in your own kind of faith growth? What kind of role has that played? That idea of what some people, of course, might be really weirded out by, or think. And in some cases, I've some non-Catholic friends sometimes who, like, they're so weird. It just seems so, spooky to them.
It seems alien if you're not really,
Right.
if you didn't grow up with it. It can be
Sure.
very alien. And I have some benefit of not, I grew up with Catholic relatives, but I was not Catholic growing up and
Right.
chose the faith in my adulthood. And with a lot of relics and miracles, I felt a real challenge to that, because sometimes I'm like, okay, I can believe that they believe it, but I don't know if I believe it.
Right.
Whereas a lot of things like relics, or recently I've been reading about levitation among early modern saints in this beautiful book called They Flew by a Yale historian, Carlos Ire. And it's all
Oh yeah.
about levitating saints and how many people witness this. And
Right.
that pushes my faith to go, okay, Catholic,
Yeah.
I believe with the church that miracles still happen, and that these
Right.
miracles can be brought about through things like relics, the saints, intercessory prayer. Do I actually truly believe that? And what does that say for the rest of my worldview if I believe that?
Sure. And I feel like I find I teach high school
Yeah.
theology, and it comes up in different ways. And the last time it came up, I think something that was neat, that was a discussion that sort of came out of that for us, was, doesn't it really test you in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what do you really actually believe about like the incarnation?
Yes.
Because I think, like, there's this idea, like, I think whether we mean to or not, a lot of people, a lot of card carrying Christians who are very sincere, but I think when you really press it, you're like, well, don't you kind of have an anti-incarnational notion here? Because when someone dies, you're thinking, well, they're in heaven or maybe they're in purgatory, but you do have this sort of notion that, well, their body's something different and it's no longer
Mm-hmm.
important. It's like, no, it's still their body,
It's
So yeah, I mean, we're privileged to have a little first class relic we sort of inherited up in our house here of St.
oh.
Elizabeth Ann Seton. And
Oh.
I don't even know, it looks like a bone fragment or something, but
Mm-hmm.
every day now I'm walking past it like, there she is. Like,
No,
that's a direct connection. It's so cool.
it's very cool, and it's a wonderful thing that's been part of our faith since the very early ages. The bones of the martyrs were revered and given
Yeah.
proper respect and burial, and miracles were attributed to them. As I like to point out, it's very similar to when Christ healed a woman through touching the hem of his robe. It's a very
Yeah.
normal, everyday, modern thing, but God can still use our material world to work great miracles.
Right.
And that happens, especially we see throughout history through the relics of the saints. And
Sure.
they still happen, which is also something really cool to look into.
Right. I think some people get confused too. They're thinking it's like, it's not a magic talisman. You're right.
No.
I mean, all healing, all exorcism, like, all of it is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But the instrumentation, like, well, I mean, like, we just had the gospel reading recently. He spits in the ground and makes dirt or clay.
Yes.
And in fact, I was telling my students about that, because I said, guys, make no mistake. I'm getting theatrical with it. I'm like, I'm pretending I'm like Andrew off to the side, and I'm like, he's talking to the crowd. He's like, oh man, here it comes. You're going to love this. He's, and then he, like, Jesus spits in the dirt. And then Andrew's like, he doesn't normally do that. Like, I was like, don't think it wasn't awkward sometimes, right? For the apostles, but the message is so beautiful that God is using, like, he's working through stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes, my flesh, right? Or even
Yes.
his cloak, or the shadow of Paul or whatever, or Peter,
Yes.
passing over sick people.
Exactly.
So,
And
yeah.
it's a sign we see again and again throughout the beliefs that we look through our ancestors, even up to modern times. that the saints really can bring about healing through their intercessory prayer. And for a Catholic, that gives me tremendous hope because, well, there's a lot going on wrong in the world, a lot strange things happening, and there's something that we can cling on to and re-going over these stories and belief systems.
Right. Yeah. Well, and because, of course, this will date this a little bit. I mean, someone might be watching this any time of year in the future, but right now, for the people watching it when it's first coming out, we're going into, coming up on St. Patrick's Day here, right? In the middle of, beginning of Lent this time around. It's always a little different, right, where it falls. But you had a great section here on St. Patrick, apostle to the Irish and demon chaser.
Yes.
And then of course, St. Columba and the Loch Ness monster. So I don't know, what do you maybe want to share about either of those?
Sure.
Really
well, St. Patrick is a great figure. He is a real historic figure that we know existed in the 5th century. So he is part of the early Christian faith. He, like I call him, and he is declared by the church the apostle to the Irish. Even though he wasn't Irish, he was Roman British, something like that. And
I think the Scots, the Welsh, and the English all claim him.
They all claim him, but some Romano-Briton figure.
Yeah.
He wrote a couple things that we can absolutely attribute to him, but there's so much myth and legend that comes out of his existence. And one of my favorites is, as now, he was starting Lent in 441 AD, and he was climbing the tallest mountain in County Mayo, what's now called Croagh Patrick. I apologize to the Irish audience. I cannot pronounce these. I'm sorry. But he went up to do penance, to fast and pray and prepare for Easter. And all of a sudden, he gets bombarded with demonic ravens who are calling out cackles and mocking his faith. And he swipes at them with his crozier. They all disappear into black smoke and then reform to continue to mock him. They would go away with holy water, but would harass fishermen and children on the way back to further mock him. And it was only when he raised his sacred bell to call out to prayer that it rang through. The demonic birds flew away in anguish and were replaced by white doves who sang songs of praise. Nice. And this is just one of many stories of St. Patrick that you can find. Like, he battled monsters, he dealt with old spirits, and it was a wonder worker in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah, you get a little flavor of that. Again, I don't get paid for this promotion, but the Augustine Institute. Have you heard their the dramatic what's it called, the audio drama about St. Patrick?
No, I haven't. I'll
have to send you the link later. I'll link it below too, because that's and it's got like John Rhys Davies as like old Patrick, of course, and but it's pretty cool because there are a few segments where they get into some of that more just really like just crazy, like edge of the world type, adventure stuff. So I get that vibe. Well, and of course, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to say, what's wonderful about a lot of these sites and battles he did with demons, they are now pilgrimage spots and remain pilgrimage spots even during what were known as the penal times, when Catholicism was outlawed in various forms in Ireland.
Right. Did you, and actually, that reminds me, I'm forgetting if it was in the chapter here, did you talk about, I'm forgetting it now, it was Loch Derg or whatever,
Loch Derg, the St. Patrick's Purgatory.
Yeah, I've seen that. I think a lot of people saw that segment. Bishop Barron had a lot of coverage of that in the one
cool.
Catholicism episode years back, but that was the first place I heard about it. But I can't remember if you get into that in the book.
Very briefly, I just mentioned he did battle with an ancient serpent, just like St. Columba, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But this serpent, and then in Loch Derg, he found a cave that was an entrance into purgatory, which became something. It had a locked door. It's been buried since the 1630s, I believe. But before that, it had a heavy door, and only a few were allowed to go in, where they would have visions of purgatorial spirits, demons, things of that nature. Most famously was a Knight Owen, who saw in the 12th century experience the purgatory after a life of warfare and bloodshed. He wanted to go and do penance, and he was shown the purgatorial spirits. He was shown demons and their various ways of tempting humanity. And it became a story that was widespread throughout Europe, even down into Italy, where they have frescoes of St. Patrick's Purgatory
Mm-hmm.
in the Umbrian town of Todi. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's something that really influenced a lot of people, but you might have not heard
Yeah.
of in everyday
Right.
Catholicism.
Well, and then that's that. You mentioned Saint Columba.
Yes.
Maybe remind us of that a little bit here, because now
Yes.
he goes from Ireland to Scotland, correct? Is that
Yes,
okay?
stopping
Yeah.
first at Iona, where he establishes the
Right.
abbey there,
Yeah.
which produced great manuscripts for Christianity and a lot of wonderful liturgies. It's a cultural
Right.
center. So for that alone, he would have been famous, but he continued on his missionary work to Scotland, where he became known as the Apostle to the Picts. This was in the 6th century, so a couple generations after Patrick. And he's continuing that missionary spirit by going back to the great British Isles
Mm.
to evangelize the ancient Scots. And he too, like St. Patrick, did battle with many a monsters and performed a lot of miracles, baptizing and converting people all along the way while preaching with his band of
Yeah.
monks.
Well, and one one rather famous monster potentially here,
Yes,
at least the legend goes. So you tell us about that just a little bit. This
sure.
run-in with Nessie.
Yes, Nessie, the Loch Ness
Yeah.
monster. So there's a lot of people who love to connect Nessie with this ancient tale that comes from the Vita Columba, and which was written about 80 years after his death, I believe.
Mm.
And in the Vita, it tells of a time when he was by the river Ness and some people were burying their dead. And they mentioned that there was this great sea serpent in the river that was coming out and eating people and attacking people. Columba was reported as being far from concerned, so he orders one of his monks to dive into the river to go fetch some boats from the other side. And
That's my favorite part, by the way. I have to laugh a little bit. He's like, "Yeah, I'm not worried about this. Hey, Jim,
yeah,
hop in the." He's like, "Why don't you go out there real quick?" Like, he
it
just steps
was
back. No.
it was absolute monastic obedience that would challenge all
Yeah.
of us.
Right.
Hey, I see a monster. You go surf in the boats. And he
Yeah.
does, and it does in fact draw out the monster, who comes mouth open ready for a next meal. St. Columba raises the sign of the cross and orders the creature back and says it will go no further. Sure enough, it was driven away by this man of God, and the people were converted at seeing this monster so easily defeated with just the sign of the cross.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, and a lot of people connected, even though it's the river Ness, they connected
Mm-hmm.
with the Loch Ness monster to show that there had been talks of sea creatures in this
Yeah.
area for long before tourists got interested in the 20th century.
Sure. Well, what would you say here, Michael, too, about like, with stories like this,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, a skeptic will just very quickly say, "Oh, there's nothing to that but absolute fantasy." Maybe distinguish here a little bit between like
Sure.
what we can know historically versus, what's wrong with there being a very deep or profound sort of spiritual takeaway for us here that we can enjoy maybe through a story that might be factually true, might not be. How do you kind of walk that tightrope a little bit?
No, so we do know one thing factually, and I talk about it at the beginning of the book because it's the one part of Catholicism we do take literally, that
Hmm.
Saint Michael the Archangel slew the ancient serpent, Satan,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
casted him and a third of the angels from heaven. That was something we do believe and think happened. And in a lot of
Hmm.
these, it's demonic more than anything else. And that's
Right.
what we are actually believing. Whether you want to say these stories literally happen, I present them as they were presented, but there's also a deeper layer to it. Like Dante talks about in his letters, when we read scripture, we know that there's a literal meaning, and there's also the parable, the metaphor, the things
Hmm.
that the deeper levels that we can get from scripture. And so
Sure.
with these, if we don't take them literally, we can still see what they were teaching our ancestors, things such as
Right.
faith and endurance through hard, difficult times, and also fortitude, ability to stand up against, demonic crows or whatever
Right.
unknown thing assaults you in this world, and be
Sure.
able to still sing the name of God.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, isn't that, it reminds me, I'm going to butcher it, but paraphrasing, I think Chesterton, because Chesterton said something about everything, but I
Yes.
think Chesterton said something right about like, the fairy tales essentially, not so much being concerned with whether, or with proving the factual existence of dragons as we might imagine them in our mind, but rather teaching us that dragons can be defeated.
Yeah,
Something
that's
along those
actually the
lines.
opening quote of my book. It's
Oh, is that?
the
Oh,
baby
that's
has known the
right.
dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy
Yes,
tale provides for him is a Saint George to kill the dragon.
that's it. Oh my gosh, yeah, seriously, from Tremendous Trifles. I didn't even bookmark
Great
that.
book.
There you go. That was meant to be. Yeah. So
Yes.
there you go. Yeah, reference. Yeah, reference. What was the very top of the first chapter, part 1 there, page 9. Page 9. It's cited there. So yeah, so great. And I did want to ask you, because you talk quite a bit here about ossuaries, and this kind of maybe
Yes.
connects to the relic thing, maybe in an adjacent way, because I think the
Mm-hmm.
key,
Mm-hmm.
what really intrigues me here is with some of these ossuaries, the church, is not, I think, claiming correct here that all of these people are obviously known to be saints or like canonized
Mm-hmm.
saints, but just the sheer reality of this connection, right, between the soul and the body, this kind of
Mm-hmm.
ongoing community. Maybe talk about that a little bit. And I loved how you shared about your own sort of experience of discovering
Yes.
these, and how not everybody always sees it the way you do.
No, and I'll be honest, I didn't see it the way I did. It was
Fair enough. It's kind of
what
shocking when you see. I'll
it
put some of the pictures up here. Yeah.
it absolutely shocked me. I was studying in Rome. I was still a new Catholic, maybe only 2 or 3 years into my faith, and I was decided I wanted to go see this famous bone church that, Mark Twain had written about and Nathaniel Hawthorne had talked about it. So of course I needed to see it because
Right.
they said it was ooky and spooky, and I like ooky spooky things. So I was going there for that. I was not expecting what happened, which was not. It was a spiritual gut punch of memento mori, is the only way I can describe it. I was being quiet because someone in front of me was praying a rosary, and I felt moved. Okay, I'm going to pray for these souls too, as they're asking me to. You're greeted first by the depiction of the raising of Lazarus, reminding that God will, and a passage from Ezekiel reminding you that God is going to someday breathe life into these bones, that the resurrection
Yeah.
will happen and the dead will come back to life. And also, it got me thinking, like, these were my brothers in Christ. We were separated by so much, language, culture, oceans, and
Yeah.
time itself, but they were still my brothers in Christ, and I was praying for them as they were praying for me. And they even remind you of that in one of the skeletal monks holding the sign says, what we are now, what you are now, we once were, what we are now, you shall be. It's a
Yeah.
reminder that death
Wow.
has to come for all of us, and it doesn't
Right.
have to be what I was hoping for, a spooky, scary experience. It can actually be something that is filled with a lot of hope and joy.
Yeah.
And
Well, and
that's,
I feel like
I found
there's
it
a
somehow.
there's an obvious sort of connection, I feel like, with vulnerability there, because that word gets
Mm-hmm.
thrown around a lot, and then C.S.
Sure.
Lewis has that great section about like to love at all is to be vulnerable, and but I mean, I don't know, nothing says vulnerability to me more than like a skeleton in a cassock, or in a
Mm-hmm.
Franciscan robes. I mean, like there's no power in the normal earthly categories there, I would imagine, that we're talking about the epitome of faith and hope, in the end result, the final
Yes.
resurrection.
No,
Um,
exactly. As St. Paul says, the last enemy defeated is death, and
yeah,
Christ has defeated death through his resurrection, but we wait for that fulfillment in his resurrection.
right.
But until then, we have to contend with death is going to be something we can't avoid any more than Christ could avoid it.
Well, and isn't it interesting too how doesn't it open a lot of neat meditations. One that comes to
Mm-hmm.
mind for me is, so again, something I was talking to my students about the other day. We were starting to get into this eschatology discussion, and I said, it's interesting. I said, I picked Saint Catherine of Siena. I was like, Saint
Yes.
Catherine of Siena, you can ask her to pray for you anytime you want, and she'll do it. And she loves you, and she can hear you, and all by the power of Christ. I said, and here's the thing, guys, she doesn't have a brain. I was like, because I've seen her, like, I was like, right now in 2025, I said, I have knelt in the chapel in
Yes.
Siena, and like 15 feet away is the skeleton head of Catherine of Siena, this 14th century, Italian, beautiful holy woman. And I was like, I was just struck praying there that day where I'm like, That's her head. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like her brain that used to be in that skull has decayed and wasted away. Like there's something more to our mind, right? You know, and our spirit,
Mm-hmm.
our ability to commune with one another. There's something mystical about this that
Yes.
it doesn't negate the brain. Her brain will be reconstituted one day and be in her physical head in the resurrection, but it's not dependent on that. So like it's just all these cool conversations that opens up. Like, what does that mean? And all that's for all
Mm-hmm.
these people in that chapel, thousands of you know
Oh yes, I've
bones
been
and
there.
skulls.
It's
And we
yeah.
did we to be fair, I have not been in the is it the Capuchin crypt, correct?
Yes, in Rome.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
haven't. We didn't make it there, sadly, when we were in Rome. But next time, hopefully, if we get there again,
Yeah.
it's high
I
on the list.
I recommend it. It's a lot more touristy than a lot. It's definitely the most famous
Sure.
of the bone chapels, but the museum the Capuchins host is wonderful. It has a it has an original Caravaggio for some reason, and
Right.
things like that. So it has some wonderful,
just in there.
just their odd collection of things before you really get the. I think it sets it up nicely. They tell you the story of their order, of their ministry, and their care for the dead. And then you get into the ossuary where you're a little more prepared than I think you were in years past when it was just through a door in the church.
Yeah, can you imagine like some kid just just wanders? I'm sure it's happened. Some kid
Oh, yes.
wanders in and just like wets their diaper or something. You're like, mommy,
Well,
skeletons.
like I said, Mark Twain and Nathaniel Hawthorne toured it when it was, a very strange tourist attraction
Sure.
and they both they described it as grotesque and unnerving and things like that. So I can understand why people would get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny because it does make you wonder. Like, I mean, all in God's providence, right? Because back to Catherine of Siena, like I like to
Mm-hmm.
point out to my students, guys, Catherine wasn't beheaded.
Yes.
I was like, and you see them start to think about it. Like, wait a minute. I was like, yeah. I was like, my Italian Catholic brothers and sisters get a little, a little zealous sometimes. But like at some point later, after she died, like I want her head. I want. You're like, oh boy. So I can understand. There is something to be said, people, about like discretion and respect, and
Sure.
so we, of course, I think the church probably in its teachings on proper care, certainly in more recent centuries, like we shouldn't be, like all the fighting over Fulton Sheen's body, for example. I
Mm-hmm.
think they're like, all right, we don't want anyone from Peoria being like, we're going to take his arm if nothing else. Like, no, no, no.
Exact. No,
So,
sometimes I jokingly call them relic fights in the book, but sometimes,
right,
yeah,
yeah,
cities would get relics through piracy or trickery and
right,
things like that, and it's an interesting thing to read about in the Catholic Church. It's adds
yes.
a sense of adventure to some of these relics.
Well, and back to the title of your book, there's a lot of weird, to be fair, like some weird stuff. Which actually, there's another neat connection here, maybe through the sort of maybe tourism side here, and like the not
Mm-hmm.
maybe super well known chapels, maybe through your experience, like you talk a little bit about the Purgatory Museum.
Yes.
Maybe do you think that would be maybe a good way into I want to make sure we can chat for a little bit about some of these ghost stories, or like the werewolves. Like
Sure.
there's some other funky ones here that are cool. Wherever you
Yes.
want to go with that.
Absolutely. So it's a little museum in the back of a church called Sacred Heart, just maybe a 15-minute walk from Castel San Angelo.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Okay.
if you go into this church, go in the back. It's a tiny room. You can see it in minutes, but take time to look at it because it's a collection from one French missionary priest of items that were touched by purgatorial souls. This includes handprints burnt into books, fingerprints burnt into money, a image that Father Jowett had captured of his burnt when his church had a fire, a face had burnt into the back of the church that he thought was a purgatorial soul. And so there's a
Oh.
picture of that, and it is fascinating and also a very, like you said, a kind of an interesting look into what I call Catholic ghost stories of when souls from either purgatory, we wouldn't call them ghost stories, but also from heaven will come and visit the living. And there's stories that go back all the way to St. Gregory the Great and quoted by Thomas Aquinas. And one of my favorites is John Bosco, who had a.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Remind me of that a little bit. Yeah. That's
sure. That one is a sweet one because it's actually
yeah.
reassuring. He had a friend named Luigi
That
who
was beautiful.
unfortunately died of various things before his 21st birthday while they were both in seminary. Before that death, however, years before, when no one knew there was any problems, Don Bosco and Luigi made this kind of friend joking wager that if one of them dies before the other, they'll come back and tell them if they've been saved.
Like a pact kind of thing.
Yeah, and they
Yeah.
totally said they was in jest, and that
Right.
Don Bosco would later also tell people don't enter into these sort of pacts. But as it happened, Luigi died, and Don Bosco was, of course, really sad, and they were very close friends, and this was heartbreaking to him. He waited at Mass, the Requiem Mass, for a sign. No sign came. So he went to bed late at night into the dormitory, still thinking about this wager they had made initially in jest, but now took on a new serious tone. And that's when the noises started. It sounded like a heavy wagon being drawn by horses coming down the hall. And the room started shaking. All the seminarians started huddling together out of fear. And Don Bosco later recalled he felt close to death at that moment. And then suddenly the door opens, a light illuminates the room, and they can hear the voice of Luigi call out 3 times, "Bosco, I am saved." And the people who knew of the wager all knew exactly what happened. The rest were just left confused till they were filled in. But yeah, it's one of those.
They look at him, he's shaking, he's like, I'll tell you later. Yeah, that's so awesome. Oh my goodness. Well, and isn't that that's so like, the thing is, it's funny, you know, I say this with great care and great,
of course,
great caution, but like, like again, I keep thinking about just the title of the book here too. Like, you could make the argument that God is a little weird, at least from our perspective. I mean, like, he doesn't. It's not and this is the thing I think is so beautiful about all this. It's not a math problem. Nothing against math, right? Logic and mathematics are part of God's, creation. But it's. I love, like, Peter Creavey likes to point out, he's like, God is far more a storyteller than he is an engineer. Like, there's mechanics, there's structure to it, but he's not bound to any of that. And if, like, he gives us the parameters, like, okay, don't conjure the dead. What's ironic to me about it is he doesn't say, this is, I point out to some people sometimes, he doesn't say conjuring the dead isn't a thing. I mean, Saul does it in the Old Testament. Samuel shows up, he's like, what are you doing this for? Like, don't do that, so there's mystery, I think, in everything. And I think there's, with all of this, there's just a real call to, humility and to wonder and awe, which is a recurring theme on my channel for all things we talk about, like, against that reductionist, it's just this, or here's the perfect solution for it. So with kind of that as, I guess, a backdrop, here's my question for you. With when it comes to these ghost stories, for example, and I'll just maybe pitch you the wizard clip here, because that I was fascinated about that ever since I heard Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World did a big coverage of that. Maybe looking at some of those questions of, like, wonder and awe and the unknown. Like, obviously it's a big, complicated story. There's a lot to it. What about the wizard clip story? Maybe can you just give us a little summary and what really jumps out at you about that as far as some takeaways?
Oh, my goodness. What jumps out to me is it's a wonderful mix of Catholic belief and Appalachian folklore happening in the 1790s, right at the beginning of the American Republic. And it's, I call it a lot of people call it America's first poltergeist case. And it's, you see why, because it is, the short of it is, this family called the Livingstons in what's now West Virginia were being assaulted by an unseen force. It got its name, the Wizard Clip, because the family and others would hear the sounds of phantom shears opening and closing before they would find their handkerchiefs cut up, their house linens cut with crescent moons in them. And this would happen even if they had their handkerchiefs in their pocket or they secured the house linens in a trunk. The thing always got to them, and it kept getting more and more aggressive. It started messing with their fires, so they were afraid to have a fire at night. It would attack they couldn't keep birds on the property because it would attack them. And it just kept getting worse until the father had a dream where he saw a man in black robes and heard the voice saying, "This is the man who will bring you comfort." Through his Irish Catholic neighbors, he found himself at Mass where he saw that said man. And this was at a time when
Mass... This is after he's, like, someone else gave him advice to see a priest, but he's like, no, I'm going to, like, didn't he go to, like,
Oh
different
yes.
ministers, and
Oh
like even like a witch doctor, almost like an Appalachian kind of like,
yeah. A folk magic
a
conjurer is
folk
the
magic,
term.
right? Yeah,
Yeah, he
yeah,
saw every form of help, and both the Episcopalian and the Lutheran ministers said they couldn't help him.
right.
And then he tried a folk magic conjurer who gave him some sacred herbs to put around the house. The herbs were placed in a chamber pot by the spirit as a mockery to everything.
Right.
And it wasn't until he got to Mass that it really started to help. The Father Cahill, though he was not convinced at first, soon became convinced after he saw things like money uh, appearing out of thin air and
Yeah.
things like that. And then he brought in a man who's on his way to sainthood, servant of God Demetrius Augustine Gallitzin, to help
Yeah.
investigate and perform an exorcism.
That's Prince Gallitzin, right? Because
Yes.
he's huge. So I'm in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area, real close
Oh,
to
yeah,
Gettysburg.
yeah.
But just west of us, we lived in State College near Penn State for a while, and I mean he's all over the place out there,
Yes.
and that's sort of western Pennsylvania, and then down into like West Virginia and stuff, and so yeah, that was a cool thing to kind of see his role in this, very front and center.
Mm-hmm. No, he's a fascinating figure. I want to learn more about. The more I
Yeah,
read about him, the more I'm just amazed at his endurance and his courage and how he
yeah,
really took on his Catholic faith and ran with it to where God
yeah.
wanted him to be.
By the way, you might want to look into this because now I'm remembering off the top of my head when we visited in oh geez, not Latrobe, it's
Loretto.
Loretto.
Yes.
There's some who claim that he occasionally visits his old digs there himself. So I don't know if that's
Interesting.
true or not. So or of course, again, like within our faith, there's always room potentially there for
Mm-hmm.
demonic machinations of some kind or sort of deception, of course. So we have to test the spirits, right, as Christ says. But what do you think about just like to kind of focus on the purgatory thing here? Maybe we have a couple minutes left.
Sure.
For you, especially as a convert, I'm curious about how and maybe that's a huge big sort of thing to ask you, but how do you sort of see that, or what role do you think that plays in a deeper understanding of the Christian faith from the standpoint of purgatory not being like a second chance, but this idea of the post-death final preparation for heaven for those who have
Yes.
died in right relationship with our Lord. How do you think that might play into some of these ghost stories maybe sometimes?
Well, I see you in a lot of these stories. It's always a message of hope. Even in the wizard clip, after they had gotten rid of the demonic influences, they got visits from angels and including and purgatorial spirits. But all these
Yeah.
stories, like the medieval ones we hear, it's instruction for, as Thomas Aquinas says, for man's instruction or their discipline, and
Fair
to
enough. Yeah.
to I think he says for their intimidation, something like that. Uh,
Mm.
but these spirits are always there to tell us about what is going on in the world of the dead, and also to tell us that we can affect and help our brothers and sisters in purgatory who are still on the path to heaven just like we are. And through the church's teachings, we know that when we are praying for the souls in purgatory, those souls also pray for us in our journey to heaven. And, well, I could use all the prayers I can get.
Yeah. That's amen to that. Yeah. Well, and I think, and Paul talks about that. I couldn't find the quote, but
Sure.
Paul talks about that idea of discipline, of putting your body under, and like these sorts of things. And C.S. Lewis, certainly I love in some of his meditations. What I love about Lewis on purgatory is that he's not Catholic.
Yes.
and he's just looking at this like, doesn't this just make sense? This idea that you arrive at the front gate of heaven, you have technically died in right relationship with God. So the sort of locked gate is open, so to speak. I mean, you haven't cast yourself out of God's presence, but
Mm-hmm.
who are we to think, okay, I died in right relationship with God. That must therefore mean I'm perfectly prepared for endless bliss and living the divine life. Like, what?
Yes.
And I love that image he gives somewhere where he talks about, like, it makes sense that the person in that situation, when faced with that ultimate, reality, might say of their own volition, could I get cleaned up first? Like I would like to submit myself to this purging, and they say, well, it's gonna hurt. And you're like, even so, like I would still like that, please. So I think there's a real connection there, potentially for us to meditate on some of those kinds of mysteries, with that in mind. But yeah, let me just ask you. We have a couple minutes left, Michael. Anything else you want to share, or a particular story we didn't get to, or something just for the viewers, the listeners? I know they're all probably your babies here, so to speak, as far as not wanting to pick any in particular, but
Sure.
just maybe any kind of closing thoughts about why this kind of thing is potentially a good endeavor for somebody to kind of explore these deeper currents and mysteries.
One, I love to get people interested in the history of the church local to them. I found out about the wizard clip through a Italian missionary priest who was here in Colorado and worked at a parish I visit up in Central City. And he wrote a book about the wizard clip, and that's how I discovered the story. And you never know what treasures are lurking in your own local parish.
Yeah,
and
sure.
One story, as we come up with the Feast of St. Joseph, I bring up the St. Joseph staircase in Santa Fe, which, if you believe the story, the nuns...
I want to see that someday,
Yes. The nuns tell us that they prayed a novena St. Joseph, one I pray frequently. It's a 9-day set of prayers. And one day a stranger showed up to build them this much-needed staircase. And not just any staircase, it's a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It doesn't have a central support beam, it's self-supporting, and it's beautiful. No one could figure out who this man was because he left without payment or thank yous. And none of the lumber yards knew who this guy was, none of the other workers. So the sisters proclaimed that it must have been St. Joseph personally answering that novena. And that's just the little things you can find throughout history of the saints personally intervening and helping us through this life.
Sure. Oh, well, Michael, thank you so much. It's been a real delight to chat with you a little bit here, and just I'm happy to pitch the book. I've recommended it to a bunch of people already, and like I said, links below, and to follow your work. Want to share your website with us? I'll have it below too. But anything else you have coming up that people you want to tell people about or look forward to?
I need to asking the Holy Spirit what my next project should be. So if people want to pray for that, I appreciate it. And otherwise follow. We'll see what happens.
Sounds great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us here on the Gracious Guest Show, I should say, today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a joy.
God bless you. There's so much more than that in here. I really, really recommend this too. It was a lot of fun. It was a great read, a great sort of compendium. And I really kind of blasted through it, but so many cool things, other things we didn't even get into, but a wide array of the like I said at the beginning of this, at the outset of the show, this sort of off the beaten trail of the Catholic faith, some really fun stuff. So be sure you check that out. Thanks so much for stopping by here today on the Gracious Guest Show. I'm your host, Mike Creavey, and until next time, don't forget to wonder.